The West, Native Americans. And make note here, we're going back to chapter 18, and so now we're going to be looking at like the new West sections of that chapter. So, a lot of Americans were moving west during this time period, but really the first obstacle for them exploiting the West and all of its land and resources and everything was the fact that people already lived there. The Native Americans had long inhabited the American West, and they had their own variety of economies and cultures. And so basically we're going to see as white people move west, they're going to attempt to subjugate the Native Americans, displace them, and strip them of their culture. Eventually, the Native Americans will be basically forced onto desolate reservations. And as much as that was successful in taking away their land, attempts to destroy their beliefs and transform their way of life are going to be much less successful. So looking at Native American culture, I could do an entire class on this alone. I am unfortunately not going to be able to do that though, because there's just so much information. So I'm going to give you some generalizations. When it comes to Native American culture, generally speaking, tribes are going to emphasize community welfare over individual interests. So their economies are more going to be based off of subsistence rather than profit. They would want to, of course, ward off sickness, injury, death, misfortune, and they were intensely religious. For them, when they're putting the community above the individual, they view resources like land, they view it like water or air, that it's a part of nature and it should be used communally and not by an individual, because by having an individual personal property, that excludes other people from using that land. However, if you think back to everything we've been talking about in this class so far, this basically means Native American culture is completely incompatible with white culture at this time. White people, as they moved west, saw natives as savages because Native Americans rejected the concept of, white people rejected the concept of communal property, and they had their own cultural goals of basically extracting as much wealth as possible from the land and having a market economy. So how does the federal government get involved in this? The thing is, before I get to that, white migrations out west really devastated Native Americans who at this point in time were basically competing amongst themselves for limited resources such as timber, pastures, and just land in general. So as white people move west, they're going to blaze all kinds of new trails, and these trails would disrupt buffalo grazing patterns. Plus, white people would eliminate a lot of buffalo from hunting ranges, and that also hurts Native Americans. And then, of course, as white people move west, they bring disease with them. Disease spread across the Americas multiple times. We've seen it before, especially if you've taken 1301 and everything like that. So we're seeing, once again, more diseases being spread to more tribes and everything like that. They just couldn't get the immunity, unfortunately, fast enough to combat all of these diseases. This would be things like smallpox, cholera, measles, whooping cough, and scarlet fever. This kills up to about 40% of the population in any given place. Again, so you have to kind of think about that you have percentages on top of percentages. White people, as they moved west, also really wanted land for agriculture, and so basically they're going to demand the removal of Native Americans. I should also mention white people wanted the land for railroads so that they can expand west as well. So this is when the federal government gets involved. The federal government would relocate tribes to basically separate and specific reservations. Then they would have restrictions on these tribes to stay in these smaller, much smaller communities and promise these like annual payments of like livestock, clothing, and just other kinds of materials. On top of that, the federal government would order the army to keep Indians on these assigned reservations. The thing is, a lot of these treaties that were signed with Native Americans really disadvantaged tribes. They would purposely omit provisions that Indians had specifically asked for, and sometimes they would include provisions that Native Americans had specifically rejected. Congress at any time might just sharply reduce annual payments or the size of the reservations for the tribes in these treaties.